Video được Việt hóa bởi Ngọc Tân từ group tài nguyên dựng phim. Nghiêm cấm các hành vi lích về rồi bán cho thằng khác. Hãy trân trọng cái mục đích của mình.
There are three settings that control the exposure of your camera: the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed. Each of these settings will let more or less light be captured, the exposure in other words. As you're starting out, you probably have your camera set to automatic mode. Your camera will change the settings of the aperture, ISO, and shutter speed automatically to capture a good exposure. Sounds like a good thing, right? Well, it's not. The art of filmmaking is to take control over the settings. So let's put that camera into manual mode. You see, each of these exposure settings come with a side effect. That's why we've got three exposure settings and not just one. And it's up to the filmmaker to decide what side effect that you want to see more prominent or not. Let's start with the aperture, which are actually a series of blades within the lens. Digital cameras control these blades through a dial on the body itself. Back in the old days, this was a physical ring that you had to turn around on the lens itself. Now, as you open the aperture, more light comes through, more exposure in other words. As you close that ring, less light comes through. The sensor is being exposed less. I think that is pretty obvious. The sensor sits inside of the camera body behind the lens, by the way. As you take off the lens from the camera body, you can actually see the sensor. It's right there. This plane is what captures the image coming through the lens and transforms it into a digital video. Now, apart from changing the exposure, the aperture also changes the depth of field. That's the side effect. As you probably know, there's a focus ring on the lens. As you turn it, you can put things in the foreground in focus or in the background. The rest will then be out of focus, blurry. Again, you can let your camera do that automatically, which is not ideal, but that's for later in this class. For now, that focus ring is something that you can control. You can push it back or forward. What's in focus is called the focus field. And that field can be big or can be small. You have two people in focus, even though that they don't stand at the same distance of the camera. But you can also have only one of them in focus. Essentially, the focus field gets bigger or smaller. And the size of that focus field, which is the depth of field, can be controlled with the aperture. The more you open up the aperture, the smaller that depth of field becomes. In filmmaking terms, we talk about a shallow depth of field. And oftentimes, it's considered that a shallow depth of field is more cinematic, as the background will be more out of focus. Now, as we close the aperture, less light comes through the lens, but the focus field also becomes bigger. More elements will be in focus, but it also affects the general look of and the out of focus background. Here's the same shot where we have the talent standing at the same distance towards the camera. One of them is shot at an open aperture and the other one with a closed aperture. See what that does to the background. So the aperture is more than just an exposure setting. It's also a creative choice. Do you want more or less depth of field? And like with everything else, aperture is also expressed in a unit. It's called the f-stop. Sometimes you'll see these values on the lens itself. If not, you'll probably see these on the display of your camera. 2.8, 5.6, 8, 11. These are all different f-stop values. And the smaller this number, the more open your aperture is. The more light that comes through, the shallower the depth of field becomes. Now, the bigger this number, the more close the aperture is, the less light that comes through, and the bigger the depth of field becomes. That is in a nutshell the aperture. In the next lesson, we'll explore the ISO settings.